Space switching is an additional rigging setup that allows the character to have the arms and hands follow other parts of the body. With this setup, the animator can achieve the look he or she wants without having to do any additional and unnecessary animating. To start with the setup process, I will be using this basic Rabbit rig. Now before we begin, I want to sum up what we will be doing. With the space switch setup, we will take this IK arm control, give it a pad or a group, and constrain it to two different controls. In this case, we will be constraining it to the hips icon and the head icon, since they are the two most common parts of the body to use in this case. Next, we will create an attribute on the IK arm control and use a set-driven key to connect this attribute to the parent constraint we created. The process for setting up the space switch has a lot of similarities to the IK-FK switch setup, since we will be constraining one object to two other ones and using a set-driven key to adjust the constraint based on what we need. Now, if you aren't familiar with the material, I recommend watching the podcast on these topics before you watch the rest of this one, since they cover a lot of what we will be doing here. The first phase of this setup is padding the IK arm icon. To do this, I'm going to select the icon and I'm going to open it up here in the outliner. Now I'm going to group it by hitting Command G and move its pivot away from the origin. And I'm going to move it right to where the icon's pivot is. So I'm going to hit DV and middle mouse drag right there. We also have to make sure that we name this pad as well. So I'm going to take the name of the icon. Instead of icon, I'm going to replace it with control pad, because I like to practice not having the pad have the same suffix as the icon. Now, once we have the icon grouped, we will then create the switching constraint. We want to constrain it to the hips and head icons, so we will select in this order: hips icon, head icon. I'm going to command click the pad here and run a parent constraint. But before I actually click the constraint, I want to make sure maintain offset is on so the control doesn't move. So with that on, I'm going to click add, and there we go. So we can clearly see that the constraint is working, but it's not following 100%. So lastly, we need to create a set-driven key so the hand will follow correctly. Now we're going to make an attribute to control the set-driven key. So I'm going to open up the Add Attribute window. All right. Now, normally you would make one attribute, but instead I'm going to make two attributes. I'm going to create an attribute to turn on and off the hips icon, as well as one to turn on and off the head icon. To start, I'm going to name the first attribute follow hips, and I'm going to give it a minimum and maximum of 10. And I'm going to click add. And I'm going to do the same process for the head icon. So follow head, 0, 10, and I'm going to click OK. The reason I created separate attributes instead of just one is because if I wanted to add another control to this constraint, meaning if I wanted to have the hand follow something else, I can just add an additional attribute here and key that as well. So now that we have the attributes in place, it's time to do the set-driven key. So I'm going to go to the animation menu, go to key, and set-driven key, set. So now that we have our set-driven key window open, I just need to load the driver and drivens. So the driver in this case is the control that has the attributes we created. So I'll load that into driver. And the driven is the constraint that we created. So I'm going to load driven here. So make sure, all right. So I'm going to make sure that part of the constraint is at 0 first before I key anything, because I want the numbers in our attributes to line up with the numbers in our constraints before I do the first key. So I'm going to set these both to 0. So I'm going to start by keying the hips. So I'm going to select the follow hips attribute on our IK arm control, and then the hips icon here. I'm going to run a key. And now in the set driven key process, we always want to move the driving attribute first. So in this case 10. And I'm going to set the hips part of the constraint to 1, and I'm going to hit key. So the hips part of the constraint is now done. So I just need to do the same process for the head part of the constraint. So I select the head attribute, head part of the constraint, key to default, move driver first, then move the driven, and then hit key. And we're done. So now I just want to test to make sure that this constraint works. So I'm going to turn these off first. And I'm going to move this control to the head. And then turn on the follow head part of the constraint. So now if I rotate the head, now we see our arm and our hand are following the head. I'm just going to test it on the hips as well. Move it down to the hips here. Turn on follow hips. And rotate the hips. Excellent. And so that is the space switching constraint.